You are standing in a place that used to be called Mount Moriah. Many Old Testament scholars believe that according to the book of 2 Samuel, it is in this spot that King David purchased a threshing floor for 50 shekels of silver. You can see by this artist's rendition what this place must have looked like 1,000 years before Jesus. This piece of land ultimately became the place where both Jewish temples probably stood, both Solomon's temple and the temple of Jesus' time, the Herodian temple. While there is some debate as to the specific location of these temples, it is the consensus of most scholars that these two temples were situated on the same spot where the Muslim Dome of the Rock now sits. Now there's something else important about this spot, something that goes much farther back than the two temples. Abraham, who we read much about in the book of Genesis, is the patriarchal father of both Judaism and Islam. Jews and Christians believe that Abraham attempted to sacrifice his son Isaac on the rock that is at the very center of the Dome of the Rock. Muslims have a different take on this story. They believe that Abraham didn't attempt to sacrifice Isaac, but rather he tried to sacrifice his other son, Ishmael. That's another reason why this place is important to Jews, Christians, and Muslims. But there's something else. According to Muslims, it is here where their prophet Muhammad was supposedly catapulted into heaven, where he spoke with various celestial beings, including Jesus himself. While we have no tangible evidence that Muhammad was ever here, we know that this was the site of two great Jewish temples. Both of them were torn down by foreign nations that ultimately occupied this land, first by the Babylonians, and lastly by the Romans. The temple that Jesus knew was called the Second Temple, or the Herodian Temple, because King Herod played a great role in its construction prior to the birth of Jesus. But we're not going to take you all over the Temple Mount today. Instead, we're going to divide up the different areas of the temple over several tours, and the rest of these will come up later in the Octagon Project. Today we're going to deal with the part of the Temple Mount that is presumed to be the location of the fourth story of the merged Gospels, and that is the Annunciation to Zacharias. Now the stone that is at the base of the Dome of the Rock is not in the geographic center of the Temple Mount. If the Holy of Holies was directly over the foundation stone of the temple, then when you read about the altar of incense in story 4 of the merged Gospels, that would have taken place in what is called the sanctuary, slightly to the east, or in other words, approximately where you are standing, in a place called the Dome of the Chain. Now this story is about a man named Zacharias. Who was he? Zacharias was a Jewish priest in the 1st century, and in story 7 of the merged Gospels, he became the father of John the Baptist. But we're in story 4, where Zacharias is burning incense in the sanctuary of the temple, when he was spoken to by the archangel Gabriel, who told him that he would be the father of John the Baptist. In our 4 canonized Gospels, Zacharias' name only appears in the Gospel of Luke. But that's not the only place in history where we read about this man. Zacharias is a prominent figure in the Proto-Evangelium of James, which may have been written in the 2nd century, but much of it is about the events that took place before the birth of Jesus. Now here's the first question. Where did this story come from? Who started it? According to the Gospel of Luke, Zacharias was alone in the temple sanctuary, and he was talking with an angel. So back to the question, who recorded this story? How do we know that it's legitimate and not a myth? The events of this story must have come to us first from Zacharias, and then from Mary herself. She would have heard about this entire ordeal when she went to visit Elizabeth and Zacharias for 3 months, while she was pregnant with Jesus. There is no doubt about it. Mary is the source of this story. In fact, Mary is the source of virtually everything that we know about the gospel regarding Jesus' birth and his childhood, and probably a lot more after that. Now here's an interesting fact. The original Church of the Holy Sepulchre was 1,000 feet away from this spot. What's so interesting is that the size of the Dome of the Rock is almost exactly the same size as the dome on the original Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The difference between the two domes was extremely small. It's obvious that the people who built the Dome of the Rock were deliberately copying the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And now the pieces come together. The builders of the dome wanted to erect a beautiful Muslim building that would compete with the majestic churches of Christianity and would serve as a symbolic statement to both Jews and Christians of the superiority of Islam. Now, this dome was built in the shape of an octagon. It's important to remember what the octagon symbolized in Christianity. The octagon symbolized the resurrection of Jesus and the new life in Christ. And by the time that this dome was built, the message of Jesus' resurrection was everywhere. All across this land, churches had been built with an octagonal shape, each one making an architectural statement that Jesus had risen from the dead. Notice that when the Muslims copied the octagonal scheme of the Byzantine churches, they were copying this architectural statement that Jesus had risen from the dead, which is a teaching that the Muslims deny. And yet this building stands here with all of the symbols that point to the truth of the resurrection of Jesus. If the builders had understood that this is what the number 8 symbolized, they might have reconsidered building this dome with 8 sides. But as it is, the Dome of the Rock, being Jerusalem's most recognizable landmark, is in itself a standing witness that Jesus Christ has been resurrected. And this is the epitome of irony. Instead of just being a statement against Christianity, the people who worship here find themselves occupying a dome that by its design affirms the truth of Christianity. So let's step into the dome and take a look around. Here is something that surprises most people. The builders of this dome had a huge preoccupation with Jesus, and that is evidenced by the fact that we read all about Jesus in the inscriptions that refer to him all over this dome. About 1/3 of all the inscriptions on the Dome of the Rock are about Jesus. Most of what is written praises Jesus as a true prophet, and a couple of lines exhort Christians to depart from what they call the error of the divinity of Jesus. Now, why is there so much written about Jesus on this dome? Well, you have to remember that starting in 325 AD, this entire land was a Christian nation. That is, during the Byzantine era, and the Dome of the Rock was built very soon after the Byzantine age ended. The most important thing on the mind of the new Muslim landlords was to defeat the prevailing idea that God had a son. What they failed to realize is that God doesn't just have a son. God is a son. He is a father, and he is a spirit. He is one God who expresses himself in multiple persons. When it was built, this dome was a statement to the Jews because of its location, being on the same site as their former temple. And it was a statement to Christians because of the inscriptions written on the dome, and because the builders intended it to be the same size as the dome that covered the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. If you'd like to read a translation of these inscriptions, you can read them from the page that features Tour 2 of the Octagon Project. Now, there's something else very interesting about the Dome of the Rock. Under the foundation stone, there is a cave. This cave is partly natural and partly man-made. It's called the Cave or the Well of Souls because of an Islamic tradition that the souls of the dead reside here awaiting Judgment Day, Today it is used as a Muslim prayer room. Another interesting thing about this cave is that under the carpeting there is ornate marble tilework, and that the floor in the very center beneath this tile is hollow, but no one knows what is down there. There are 4 little prayer altars in this cave, one dedicated to Abraham, one to David, one to Solomon, and one to Elijah. You will notice that all of these are Old Testament persons. And on this concrete wall, there is a prayer niche called the mihrab. In Muslim places of worship, the mihrab always faces Mecca, which is the direction that Muslims are told to pray. This is the oldest mihrab in existence, dating sometime around the 9th century. Take a look at the video screen in the center of this room, and I'll tell you a little bit more about the place you're in right now. The Dome of the Rock has been sitting on the site of the Jewish temple since 692 AD, and it has looked virtually the same for 1,300 years. In 1993, King Hussein of Jordan purchased 80 kilograms of gold for $8.2 million, and this gold is what covers the dome today. The interior is equally lavish, every square centimeter being decorated with marble and mosaic tiles. When I walked into the dome, I tried to imagine what the shrine looked like when only the sunlight through the windows illuminated the interior. There are several vintage photos of this place and of the rock over which it was built. This was the foundation stone for the Jewish temple, and the rock on which it is said that Abraham attempted to sacrifice Isaac. Any renovation of the dome's interior requires scaffolding to be erected on the rock itself. An overhead view of the rock reveals a number of geometric cuts that were made by the Crusaders in the 12th century, who turned this building into a church, and this foundation stone was used to support a staircase and marble slabs. But to me, the most fascinating part of the Dome of the Rock is the room that you are standing in at this moment. The Muslims have used this as a prayer room ever since they discovered it, and as I started to search through this cave, I wondered what secrets it was keeping. For instance, the marble floor beneath the carpeting is intricately laid, and most scholars believe that it was part of the original decor of the Dome of the Rock. Unless you're around when the carpeting is being replaced, you won't see what you're seeing now. Notice that there is an 8-pointed star in the middle, corresponding to the 8 sides of the shrine itself. The star is near, but not exactly in the center of the Dome of the Rock. But it's under the rock, and my theory is that it marks the spot where the early Muslims believe that Muhammad was catapulted into heaven on his famous night journey. Now, there is another marble mosaic. Take a look at the octagon in the center of this design. You will notice that this smaller mosaic is due east of the larger mosaic. Because of its shape and position, I believe that this smaller mosaic is symbolic of the Dome of the Chain, which is also very near and due east of the Dome of the Rock. According to early Muslims, the Dome of the Chain was the center of the world. The size of the circle of the large mosaic compared to the size of the octagon in the smaller mosaic is proportional to the difference in size between the Dome of the Rock and the Dome of the Chain. As you can see, the association between the 2 actual buildings on the Temple Mount and these 2 mosaics is inescapable. If all of this is true, the floor of the Cave of Souls is actually a map, marking the location of the center of the world and the point of Muhammad's ascent into heaven. Now, is there any mention of this room in ancient history? There is. The Babylonian Talmud, which is a Jewish document written in the 3rd century, refers to this cave. We also know that the Crusaders knew about this cave in the 12th century. But what's so interesting about this cave is that it was most likely positioned directly under the Holy of Holies. Even more interesting is that there is a man-made concrete wall on one side of this cave. Now, this brings in the whole discussion about the tunnels under the Temple Mount. In fact, there are exactly 45 cisterns, chambers, tunnels, and caves under the Temple Mount. However, archaeology is entirely forbidden. It's very likely that this concrete wall in the Cave of Souls covers one of the entry points to the tunnels that exist under the Temple Mount. We have just completed our first trip to the Temple Mount and our introduction to the priest Zacharias. The Archangel Gabriel quickly departed from Zacharias, and 6 months later, he appeared in Nazareth to a young girl named Mary. And that is where we're going to take you right now.